Hello and welcome back to Outmouse Labs. My name's Penny. I'm glad you're here. Today's going to be kind of a quick one. What we're going to be talking about is a GDD, or game design document. Obviously, since most of us who are using RPG Maker are indie developers or even solo developers, we don't have to do this to make a pitch. We don't have to do this to sell our product before we've made it. But where a game design document can be helpful is in helping us organize the scope of our game, what's in our game, and what we need for our game to function in advance. As we build our game design document, we're kind of checking ourselves for, can we really do this, and what are the sort of hidden pitfalls that we may not have thought of. So I'm going to walk you away one way to do a game design document. There's obviously others. So I'm going to be using Google Docs because I don't have a copy of Office, and if I had a collaborator, this is a great way to share. So turning to the other monitor, let's take a look. So the first thing on your game design document I would recommend is a title. Now obviously if you were to take a writing workshop, they would tell you probably the opposite. They would say a title is the last thing. And that's fine. And this title may not be the title you stick with. But having a title up front gives you a way to describe it, a way to kind of create a namespace in your brain. And you can look to your title as a way to refocus on what you're doing. So for my example here, I'm doing A Tale of Two Blades to remind myself that my story hinges around two enchanted swords. Okay? Next up, I'm going to have a heading, story, and I'm going to start with the premise. You can think of the premise as kind of the back of the book, or the elevator speech, or a short summary on how the game should look. Your premise should avoid names in general, so you're going to use things like the hero instead of Daphne, just for instance. You're also going to have a wide arc of what the story is about. By example, an old legend says the world was created by twin gods who, upon completion of creation, turned themselves into the divine blades, silence and song. It is said that when one finds a wielder, the other will be taken up shortly as well. The heroes of silence and song then must make a pilgrimage to each of the four shrines of the seasons and seek the blessings of the four devas. Certainly nothing original. We're talking about elemental dungeons here. But we're putting our own spin on it, and we're doing it up front so we know exactly what's going on. The second paragraph, which I'm not going to read, does increase that a little bit or give a little bit more detail. You probably wouldn't need this second paragraph if you were, say, pitching it to some fellow developers or pitching it to a team, but since I'm a solo developer, I wanted to have a little bit more. I also mentioned some of the other characters here, but again, not by name, just by their role, such as an automaton, or robot, who has stood waiting for the Blades of Legend to appear. Next up, I have my story beats. So story beats are turning points in a story. They're the things that hinge on, often if it was a television series, a single episode would have a beat, or it might end on a beat so that you come back for next time. All stories do have beats, and there's different structures of beats for different types of stories. There's all kinds of websites for it, and some types of genres are so specific that if you miss beats, people will notice, even if they don't know that term. So for my story beats, the protagonists are forced into a cave by a rainstorm. That's my opening. They explore the cave and they find the divine blades. They are attacked by a monster, and the blades give them a tutorial. So now the player is getting a tutorial through the characters learning to use the blades. Then they go back to their village where they meet an antagonist. The antagonist chases them off and they run, but the antagonist catches up to them and forces them into a fight. They lose that fight and are saved by two new characters. And notice at this point I am starting to name my characters. I have the protagonist names, I have the two new characters, Trit and Trinity. In the story beats, I'm also saying what the relationships are. Trit and Trinity are brother and sister. Our two heroes are childhood friends. The two friends, Trent and Trinity, the two siblings who saved them, they know more than our heroes do, so they recommend the next place to go. They go to that place and move through a dungeon, fight a boss, basic RPG elements, and then that boss gives them yet more direction. At this point, I've chosen to insert a secondary villain, and this is a somewhat comedic villain. You certainly don't need to do this, but if you're a fan of Final Fantasy VI, this could be like your Ultros character, who you fight 4 or 5 times, and is always somewhat comedic, and maybe even breaks the fourth wall. So my comedic villain is the Great Barnaby, the self-proclaimed greatest thief in the world. We're going to introduce Barnaby at about this point because we're about 25% through. And for the rest of the game, when Barnaby shows up, he has his own beats. They get their first blessing and a clue on where they need to go next. They try to go to the second sanctum or temple right away, but it turns out that this temple is a sacred place for a different group, and they have to help that group before they can enter. This creates a complication and a side quest. They go through, they complete the side quest, and then they can get back on the main quest. This is a great time for the Great Barnaby to show back up. When he shows back up, he causes some trouble for the characters, moves the story forward, and gives some commentary about the game that's really for the player, not the characters. Once again, the boss becomes an informant after being defeated and gives them information on moving to the next section. They move to the next section where they meet their next playable character, Urs-9, who's the automaton mentioned in our premise. The automaton is kind of our Obi-Wan Kenobi. He really knows what's going on. He's very old, and he is sort of over it already. This is a common trope. It can be very helpful. Again, you don't have to use it. And how you use it can make a difference. With mine being a robot, it is a little bit different than being an old man or a former adventurer. Urs-9 will give them the next thing they need to accomplish, so our next beat starts with them going to a factory full of other automatons who need to build a ship so that the player, or so the characters, can reach the next zone, which is on the moon. They have to help the automatons defend the facility and then get their ship built. Once the ship is built, they'll be able to name it. The player will be able to name the ship, which is easy to do in RPG, by the way. You just make the ship a character. The character doesn't do anything but have a name, but then you can use the built-in name event, which is on, I believe, page 3, top left corner of the events. Once they reach the moon, they don't actually fight a boss this time. They just get the blessing because they've done a whole bunch to get here. There's no reason to have a boss. However, once again, the Great Barnaby shows up. So even though there's no boss, our comedic villain shows up and troubles things once more. Here's the bit of a twist, and you certainly, again, wouldn't have to do this, but you can. This time, when they defeat Barnaby for the last time, Barnaby actually joins the party. Not as a playable character, but as a steward for their ship, who provides things like free healing and a shop. It can be really rewarding for a player if they've fought the same person over and over and over again, for that person to finally flip and still be funny and comedic and sarcastic, but ultimately useful to them as they're approaching the end game. Next, we're going back to the planet, and our primary villain is starting to get nervous. At this point, our heroes have a ship, they have a staff, they have power, they have a plan. So our primary villains now really step things up. We're headed towards the final dungeon. Our primary villains have mustered their army. They do what they can to stop the players. And the players aren't able to move forward. A stuck point is really important. So in our stuck point, they try to go to the Temple of the Sun and they're repelled. No matter what they do, they can't get to that last blessing. So this is when Trent and Trinity, two of our playable characters, who mentioned at the way back in the beat where they were introduced that they have a master who taught them everything they know, says, well, let's go talk to our master. This is a kind of version of a Chekhov's gun. We mentioned there was a master way back in an earlier beat, and now near the end of the game, that beat matters. They meet Sage Alona. Sage Alona gives them the last piece of the puzzle they need, which is the ability to move through shadows undetected. That sets us up with a minigame. So the last dungeon they don't fight through, they sneak through. And you can do some interesting mechanics with that. Once they move through the final dungeon, they've sneaked through, they fight the final boss. The final boss is a callback. That very first villain in their village who chased them off is the final boss. This is satisfying for players and characters, and allows the story to close its loop. Finally, in most games like this, the final scene should mirror the first scene. So our first scene started in a cave that led to a chamber of the Divine Blades. Our last scene will be returning to that chamber, putting the swords back, resetting the world to normal. And then we end it vaguely, with only Trinity and Trent knowing what really happened. Our heroes have disappeared, and we have an exit scroll that suggests that maybe an age of prosperity lasting 1,000 years followed. If we wanted to make another game, we can set it 1,000 years in the future. Or we can have that cycle interrupted, or we can tell a totally different story. But we've got ourselves set up. Once we have our beats, we now have a really strong structure that we can go through and start building mechanics on. So our next section is mechanics and resources. So for mechanics, I'm going to use the side view weight combat system built into RPG Maker. I'm going to have the shadow walk, which is achieved using regions and the direction an enemy is facing to determine if the player's seen. E.g., if they're not on a protected region and facing down, then they're caught. So that covers our mechanic at the end of the game. The time travel that is mentioned in the beats is going to be done using map events. It's easier if held to a relatively small rooms to have copies of the map. So that basically, in order to time travel, we're going to have copies of the maps that are slightly different. And we're going to contain those points of the game to relatively small sections, because otherwise it can get unruly. Entering the end game, you have to require all 4 blessings, which will be switches, to be on when you're in the original sword chamber. So the end game is programmed in from the beginning. It's there when the game opens. It's just switches. Going to the moon. I am going to use a plugin for this by Reupload Studios, which will have a common event, which is the common event plugin. And what it'll do is if you are in your ship and you press a certain button, you'll be able to go to the moon, which will be a transfer to a small map that with a spot to land and a facility entrance may be surrounded by mountains. So it'll be a very, very, again, contained and controlled space. You could do this without plugins. You could do this by, for instance, having a character inside the ship. You go in the ship, you talk to the character, and they raise you to the moon. I think that the Common Events plugin is very nice, the button plugin, so I'm going to use it. The steal mechanic. One of the protagonists can steal things using the Outmouse Steal plugin that I made, and you are of course welcome to use that steal plugin if you'd like. It is available on my itch page for free. But again, you don't have to have a steal mechanic, and I want one, and I already have a plugin for it, so I'm going to use it. The bestiary or bestiary, I'm going to use CGMZ Encyclopedia by Casper Games. Because I like the idea of the player being able to fill out items, monsters, etc. as they go. I think it's satisfying. And there's a great plugin for it, so I would recommend it. Leveled experience, meaning I'm going to have the monsters give different experience levels, amounts of experience depending on what level the player characters are. And again, this is a Reupload Studios plugin that I'm going to use. So what have I done? I've broken my mechanics down into chunks. I've determined how they're going to work basically in advance, and I've determined what plugins I absolutely have to have. This helps stay organized, but it also helps prevent feature creep. Feature creep is the death of many a game, where you keep trying to make your game more and more complex because you don't have a core idea of what you're doing. This helps prevent that. Okay, next up is art. I'm going to be using the Customize RTP, so I'm going to use the base graphics, but I'm going to change their color, I'm going to use the clumping techniques, I'm going to use things I've learned from Avery on RPG Maker Web and other great artists on YouTube, and it'll still look somewhat like an RPG Maker game, unquestionably, but hopefully I'll have my own spin on it. I'm also going to be using the Cyclone Maps plugin by Huddle for some layering and parallaxing. I have found that for me, doing a fully parallaxed game, it requires too much work to be worth it. I'm not a strong enough artist to have every scene be totally custom. That said, having lighting effects, shadow effects, and some basic layering can really make the RTP pop. There's lots of plugins out there, but I use Huddle Cyclone Maps. Okay, then our next section is our characters. So our characters we break up into heroes, NPCs, and villains. Under heroes, this is when I finally name the characters, all of them, make sure it's good. I have Resnoa Querthus, she's our heroine, she uses lightning and wind. Xandir Petfear, who's our hero, and he uses earth and water. Trent Delcane and Trinity Delcane, brother and sister. One is a healer who uses light magic, the other is a sorceress who uses shadow magic. Urs 9, who is non-binary and is a defender of fire and time, is a defender class, fire and time elements. So I have my classes, I have my elements, I have my names, and I have my genders. I can refer to that because until your characters start to take on some definition, you're probably going to forget their names. NPCs, this will be a consistently growing list, but to start out with, I have Resnoa's Biomom and Xandir's Biomom. I have the Village Elder, I have the 2 Divine Blades, I have the Moon Elf Elder, I have Sage Alona, and I will continue adding to this NPC list as I need. For my villains, I have Prelate Dren, who's the leader of the temple and our final boss. And I have the Great Barnaby, the greatest thief in the world, comedic villain who shows up throughout the game. I may add other villains. I also have my bosses. My bosses are things like the Earth Chewer, the worm-like entity in the Chamber of the Divine Beast at the beginning. Prelate Dren when we fight him the first time. The Tempest, the Daver of Wind, the Thorn Prince, the Inevitable, a Time Guardian that seeks to prevent the party from changing the past, who is similar to Urs 9 but with a different mission. And Prelate Dren 2 when we fight him the second time and he's powered up. So again, well-organized, living document that we can grow and change, that we can always refer back to. Next we have our setting. Our setting, in the case of this game, is breaking down into the cave, the chamber, the first town, the campsite, the second town, the Wind Shrine, the Moon Elf City, which has the second shrine, the sort of Feywild space where that dungeon takes place, the past, the production facility where our starship is built, our moon location, aboard the starship, the final temple, and the inner sanctum of the final temple. Last but not least, we're going to build our database on paper in exactly the order you see it in RPG Maker. So we start out with skills. I have magic skills, and I have basics. I have fire, ice, lightning, 1, 2, 3 and all. I have earth, 1, 2, 3 and all, wind, 1, 2, 3 and all, cure, 1, 2, 3 and all, life, full life, remove poison, remove all status effects, then cause poison, blindness, silence, slow and haste, and pearl, which is an old-fashioned name for holy spells, which I enjoy. Then for martial skills, I have first aid, protect, rallying cry, crosscut, slash all, whirlwind, armor break, battle meditation, arcane meditation, and absorb. Now notice that these names are the names that you would hear in other video games. I may not use these names in the final production, but I'm getting down now what skills I want. Why am I doing this? Because the database in RPG Maker is a pain to move around. It's not well organized. It's probably the weakest thing about the engine. So if you are organized on paper, which you can move around as much as you want, you only have to build the database once. Same thing for items. I'm not going to go through each one, but I have them broken down into HP cure, MP cure, status cure, attack items. Weapons, I have types and tiers. So there'll be a tier. So for instance, there will be a copper sword, a bronze sword, an iron sword, a steel sword, and an elfin sword. That way I know exactly how many types and tiers. I can just multiply that there are 4 types and looks like I have 5 tiers, so there's going to be 20 weapons. Same thing with armor. I have general, heavy, and magic, and then their tiers. And then enemies is our bestiary. I have it broken down by region. In the Millgrove region, I have 3 types of enemies. Grey Hollow region, 3 types of enemies. Akona Rise region, 3 types of enemies. Down the line. And I didn't have to remember or make all of this up on the fly because I did this in this order. So I had my story beats, I have my location, I have my setting, and as I do each piece, I'm building on it. So this document becomes one long, well-organized document. Remember that this is going to change over time, and remember that you can use this document to help yourself remember, and if you bring anybody else on board, you can use this document to catch them up on what's going on. If you do it in Google Docs like I did, you can even share it with each other. All right, well that is a game design document, or one version of one. I hope this was helpful. As a bit of a bonus, I am going to show you one other thing. This is kind of my workflow for building a game. I make my design document, I write my script, I set up the engine with my game design document, including fonts, window skins, and settings. I populate the database. I make the map structure, so like which maps are under which. I make my characters. I make or find my monster art. I make my world map, then my other maps, then my cutscenes. I add juice and polish. I make a title sequence, and then I let playtesters tear it apart. I make any fixes, and I post it. If you follow this general outline, you have a much better chance of finishing a game. In a future video, I'm going to go over writing a script. As a quick taste, I use a program called Fade In, and I write it as though it is a film script. You certainly don't have to do this. You're not trying to sell it to a studio. But I find it to be very, very organized, and it breaks my dialogue up into natural ways. This particular program makes sure that I keep track of my characters and my locations. This is really great for later on when I've been writing for 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, and I'm forgetting things. All right, I don't think I've seen too many videos about the process of writing and organizing a project, so I hope this was helpful. I appreciate you being here. Please consider liking and subscribing if this content is useful to you, and happy game making.